The evening he told our real estate agent I wasn't ready to make big decisions yet. While I stood 3 feet away, holding the exact spreadsheet that proved otherwise, I understood he had stopped seeing me as a person in the room and started seeing me as an obstacle to be managed politely in front of witnesses. My name is Farah. His name was Nikolai. And by the time this story ends, you will understand why I spent 15 months keeping a second set of keys taped inside a birdhouse in our own backyard that he considered too impractical to ever bother with. I want to begin by saying that Nikolai was, in most rooms, the most reasonable person present. He rarely raised his voice. He had a gift for making his preferences sound like careful analysis, framing every decision he wanted as the obviously correct conclusion any sensible person would reach, so that disagreeing with him felt less like a difference of opinion and more like a failure of logic on my part. We had been married 7 years when the real estate agent moment happened. Together 10. In the early years, Nikolai's confidence looked, from any reasonable distance, like competence. He had genuinely good instincts about money, about timing, about which opportunities were worth pursuing. It took me years to notice that this same confidence also meant he had quietly stopped asking my opinion on anything significant, having decided, somewhere along the way, that his judgment alone was sufficient for both of us. We had been house hunting for months, a process I had actually led, researching neighborhoods, comparing school districts, building a detailed spreadsheet comparing every property we'd toured against our actual budget and priorities. When our agent, a patient woman named Bettina, asked at a showing whether I had thoughts on the property, Nikolai answered for me, gently, telling her I wasn't ready to make big decisions yet, that I tended to get overwhelmed by too many options at once. I stood there holding the very spreadsheet that proved I had been the one doing careful, methodical analysis for months and said nothing, because objecting in that moment would only have looked, to Bettina, like further proof of the overwhelmed Nikolai had just described. I did not confront him in the car afterward. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty matters more in this story than anger does. I let the silence sit. But that night, lying awake beside a man who had just quietly erased months of my own careful work in front of a stranger, I understood, with a clarity that startled me, that Nikolai had stopped needing me to actually be capable. He needed me to be perceived as less capable than him, consistently, in front of other people, because that perception was what justified, in his own mind, his right to make every final decision alone. I made a decision that night that would occupy the next 15 months of my life. I decided I would rebuild, quietly and entirely outside his awareness, proof of exactly how capable I actually was, and that I would keep it somewhere he would never think to look, until the day I had enough of it gathered that his version of me would simply become impossible for anyone to believe. The birdhouse became my headquarters, an elaborate wooden structure I had built myself years earlier during a brief woodworking phase Nikolai had found charmingly impractical, mounted on a post at the back of our yard, empty of any actual birds for years. Inside a hollow compartment I had originally built for cleaning access, I began keeping a prepaid phone, a small waterproof folder, and, gradually, documentation of my own. The first thing I did was begin quietly rebuilding a professional portfolio Nikolai did not know I still maintained, freelance architectural consulting work I had done occasional projects for over the years, always described to Nikolai as just a hobby thing. Income one banked into an account under my maiden name that Nikolai had no reason to search for because he had long since stopped believing my professional work amounted to anything worth tracking. The second thing I did was begin paying closer attention to what Nikolai actually did with his own time and devices, using the prepaid phone purchased with cash from a shop across the city, kept charged in short bursts, always returned to the birdhouse before he came home from work. Nikolai worked as a senior project manager at a commercial construction firm called Ashford Meridian, overseeing large-scale development projects including several public infrastructure contracts. He had worked there for 12 years and had built a reputation, among the people who mattered to his career, as unusually efficient at bringing projects in under budget, a skill that had earned him increasing responsibility over commercially sensitive municipal contracts. His supervisor, and the person he ultimately answered to, was the firm's chief executive, a woman named Beatrice Solano, 57 years old, who had built Ashford Meridian's reputation over 2 decades on the specific promise of transparent, honest bidding on public projects, in an industry where that reputation was rare enough to be genuinely valuable. I had met Beatrice twice at firm events, a sharp, direct woman who once told me, with obvious respect, that Nikolai was the most reliable project manager I have, someone I trust completely to bring public projects in clean and on budget. I remember smiling and believing her because at the time I had no reason not to. That changed 9 months into my quiet preparation. On an evening, Nikolai left his laptop open on the kitchen counter longer than usual, absorbed in a call in another room. A folder caught my attention only because of its curious name: Subcontractor Adjustments, Personal. Project managers, I understood even with my limited knowledge, generally handled subcontractor selection through the firm's own bidding systems, not personal folders on a home laptop. Inside were bid comparison documents for several municipal infrastructure projects, showing that Nikolai had, for years, been quietly steering public contracts toward a specific subcontracting firm called Vanna Group, owned, I discovered through the attached correspondence, by a man named Gideon Marsh, in exchange for kickback payments disguised as consulting fees, while officially recording competitive bids from other, ultimately rejected subcontractors as though the process had been fair. Several of the projects involved public funds for school renovations and road safety improvements, work that had, according to internal quality notes I found buried in a separate file, been completed using materials of noticeably lower quality than what the public contracts had actually paid for. I did not touch the laptop further. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it and returned to my seat before Nikolai finished his call, and I sat there afterward for a long time, understanding, with a slow, sick clarity, that the man who had quietly convinced our real estate agent I couldn't be trusted with big decisions had also spent years quietly steering public money, meant for schools and road safety, into a rigged arrangement that compromised the very infrastructure our community depended on. Over the following 10 weeks, I documented what I could, using the prepaid phone during narrow windows when Nikolai left himself logged in, always careful, always brief. I sent nothing forward yet. I understood, even then, that what I had found involved public safety and public trust on a scale far larger than my own marriage, and that acting too quickly could destroy evidence before it could ever help anyone. During this period, Nikolai's quiet dismissiveness toward my own judgment did not soften. If anything, it sharpened, an instinct I have since learned is common in men like him, some subconscious sense of shifting ground even before any specific discovery surfaces. He began, more frequently, gently correcting my opinions in front of friends, always in a tone of patient affection that made any pushback from me look, to anyone listening, like further proof of the very unreasonableness he seemed to be managing so graciously. I made certain, during this time, that my own behavior remained calm and unremarkable, because I understood that any visible frustration from me would simply become more material for the narrative he was building. The night I understood the full scope of what Nikolai had built, I was not looking at his laptop at all. I was sorting old boxes in our garage at his request, ahead of a planned move, files from years before Ashford Meridian, back when Nikolai had briefly worked at a smaller municipal contracting firm that had quietly lost its city license under circumstances he had always described vaguely as bureaucratic politics. Inside one box, beneath old project files, was a folder of early correspondence with Gideon Marsh, dated years before Nikolai ever joined Ashford Meridian at all. The arrangement, I understood with a slow, sinking clarity, was not new. Nikolai had built this exact structure once before, at a firm that had likely lost its license partly because of it, and had simply carried the same mechanism, refined and quieter, into a company that trusted him completely with public infrastructure money. I called my brother-in-law, a civil engineer named Tobias who had married my sister years earlier, and who understood infrastructure work far better than I did, that night from the prepaid phone, standing in the garage with the door pulled shut, Nikolai asleep inside the house. When I explained what I had found, he was silent for a long moment, and then he said the words that finally pushed me from careful observation into deliberate motion. He said, "Farah, this isn't just about your marriage anymore. These are schools and roads. Kids are in those buildings. You have to do something." Tobias connected me, through his own professional network, to a construction fraud investigator named Petra O'Yelleran, who specialized in exactly this kind of public contract manipulation. I called Petra from a payphone outside a garden center, paying with coins saved specifically for this purpose. She listened to my description of the bid rigging and the quality shortfalls for nearly 40 minutes without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone who understood immediately how serious it was. She told me two things I have carried with me since. The first was that what I was describing sounded like a sustained pattern of public bid rigging and kickback fraud, potentially involving compromised safety standards on public buildings, the kind of case that draws attention not only from a firm's internal leadership, but from state contract oversight boards and potentially criminal prosecutors, given the public safety implications. The second thing she said more quietly. She said, "Farah, once this moves forward, it will not stop at your marriage. It could end his freedom, and it will likely require rebuilding parts of what he compromised. I need you to understand that before we take another step." I told her I had understood that for months, and that understanding what those schools and roads represented for families in our own community was exactly why I could not simply walk away without acting. Over the following 11 weeks, working carefully through the prepaid phone and narrow windows of opportunity, I sent Petra everything: the photographed bid comparisons, the correspondence with Gideon Marsh, the older files establishing the scheme's origin at Nikolai's previous firm. Petra compiled a preliminary investigative summary, methodical and precise, designed to withstand scrutiny from a firm and a municipal government that both had every incentive to hope it was not true. While Petra worked, I made two further preparations. The first was a consultation with a family attorney named Odessa Brandt, recommended through Tobias's network, who specialized in cases involving strategic diminishment within marriages, a pattern she described with an accuracy that unsettled me the first time I heard my own experience, summarized so precisely by a stranger. Odessa began quietly preparing documentation of my own professional history and financial independence, in case Nikolai attempted, as she warned me he likely would, to use his own long-cultivated narrative of my incapability against me once the larger truth came out. The second preparation was smaller, more personal. I began, item by careful item, moving what remained of my own independent belongings, my own architectural portfolio from years of work Nikolai had dismissed as a hobby, a small collection of design awards I had quietly stopped mentioning at dinner parties because they seemed to irritate him, into a storage unit rented under my maiden name, funded entirely by the freelance income he did not know still existed. I was not fleeing. I understood, by then, the distinction clearly. I was simply arriving, slowly, at a life that no longer required his narration to be believed. The final piece arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, when Nikolai mentioned over dinner, with quiet pride, that Ashford Meridian had just been awarded 2 additional municipal contracts, including a significant expansion of a regional elementary school, work that would fall directly under his personal oversight. He said it the way men like him say things they assume no one else at the table is equipped to fully understand the implications of. I refilled his water glass and said nothing, because I understood immediately what that expansion actually meant: more public money quietly diverted, more compromised construction on buildings meant to keep children safe, while everyone around him continued to trust his careful, reliable reputation completely. That same week, Petra finished her preliminary report. Odessa filed the independence documentation the following morning, submitting Petra's findings simultaneously to the State Contract Oversight Board and to Ashford Meridian's outside legal counsel, ensuring the information could not simply be quietly absorbed by anyone at the firm still loyal to Nikolai. I made one final call myself, to Beatrice Solano's office directly, using my full name for the first time in over a year, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding what I described only as a serious matter involving public contract integrity. Her assistant, a man named Julius, asked for more detail. I said it was personal and it could not wait, and something in my voice must have carried real weight, because he found me in opening the very next morning. I dressed with unusual care, a simple charcoal blazer purchased with my own freelance income, hair pulled back, carrying for the first time in over a year a portfolio folder of my own architectural work, not because it was relevant to what I needed to say, but because I wanted, for reasons I did not fully articulate even to myself, to walk into that building as a woman with her own credentials in hand. I did not attempt to disguise the particular tiredness in my own face, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 15 months being quietly vigilant every single day, because I understood, by then, that this too was its own kind of evidence, even if no formal document would ever record it. Ashford Meridian's headquarters occupied a modern glass building overlooking the river, walls lined with renderings of completed public projects, schools and libraries and community centers, the visual language of a firm that had built its identity around civic pride. Beatrice's office was lined with these same renderings, decades of projects she had personally championed. She stood when I entered, shook my hand firmly, and gestured to a chair, her expression carrying the direct curiosity of a woman with no time for small talk and no idea her morning was about to end very differently than it began. I placed a sealed folder on her desk and slid it toward her without preamble. Inside was the summary Petra and Odessa had prepared together, the bid rigging documentation alongside the correspondence with Gideon Marsh, the older files establishing the scheme's origin years before Nikolai's employment at Ashford Meridian, and a cover letter noting that copies had already been submitted to the State Contract Oversight Board that same morning. Beatrice opened the folder slowly. She read the first page, then the second, and I watched her expression move through the sequence I had, by then, come to recognize in anyone confronted, all at once, with the discovery that someone they trusted completely had been quietly betraying the very civic reputation they had built their firm's identity upon. Confusion first, then a dawning, sickened comprehension, as she began to understand which specific schools, which specific roads, had been built with compromised materials because of a scheme running directly under her own leadership. She looked up at me once, about halfway through, her hand pressed flat against the desk. I did not look away. I simply let her keep reading. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully, both hands flat against it, the stillness of a woman absorbing a betrayal that struck at the very foundation of everything she had spent 2 decades building. She asked, quietly, how long I had known. I told her the truth, that I had understood the full scope only in recent months, though the pattern itself, I suspected, predated even Nikolai's employment at Ashford Meridian. She thanked me, her voice steady but noticeably shaken, and told me the firm would cooperate fully with any investigation, whatever the cost to its own reputation, including, she said immediately, an independent structural review of every affected project. I stood, thanked her for her time, and told her the regulatory filing had already gone out that morning, timed deliberately so no one at the firm would have the opportunity to quietly manage the problem before outside investigators could examine it independently. Beatrice nodded once, slowly, already reaching for her phone as I left the room. Outside the building, I stood by the river for several minutes before walking to my car, not to collect myself, because that work had been done slowly over 15 months and there was nothing left to gather in that moment, but because I wanted to remember precisely how it felt. The folder leaving my hands, the particular quality of silence in a room where a woman who had spent decades building genuine civic trust understood, all at once, how deeply it had been compromised from within her own ranks, on buildings meant to keep children safe. Nikolai called at 2 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, each time closer together, the rhythm of a man beginning to sense, without yet understanding the specifics, that something fundamental had shifted beneath him without his permission. At 3:30, he sent a single text. It said only, "What did you do?" Not a question. He already knew, in the way guilty men always already know, even before they understand precisely what has caught up to them. I did not respond. I drove instead to the storage unit, sat for a while beside the boxes, holding what remained of my life before Nikolai's dismissiveness had worn it down, my own architectural drawings finally unrolled and spread across the concrete floor where I could actually look at them again, and allowed myself, for the first time in 15 months, to simply breathe without calculating a single next move. Then I drove home, because Odessa had advised maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy until the filings were formally processed, and because I wanted one final ordinary evening in that house as a woman who understood exactly what was coming, while Nikolai still did not. He came home late that night, unusually subdued, and did not mention the folder or the calls or the text. He asked, instead, whether I wanted to order dinner, his voice carrying the careful, softened tone he used whenever some instinct told him his control over a situation was slipping and needed to be gently recaptured rather than forced. I told him I had already eaten. I went to bed early. He sat alone downstairs for a long time before he finally came up. The State Oversight Board opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks, and Ashford Meridian placed Nikolai on administrative leave shortly after, once their own internal review confirmed the pattern Petra had already independently documented, alongside an emergency structural assessment of the elementary school project, which ultimately required significant remediation before it could safely open. He was terminated a month later and indicted the following spring, once the scale of the fraud, ultimately traced across at least 7 public projects and involving kickback payments in the high 6 figures, became impossible to characterize as an isolated lapse in judgment. I did not attend the criminal proceedings that eventually followed, though Tobias did, several times, and reported back to me afterward in a voice that had shifted, over the months, from professional alarm to something quieter and more settled, especially once the remediation work on the elementary school was completed and the building reopened, fully safe, the following fall. Nikolai accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, agreeing to a sentence that included both incarceration and substantial restitution toward the remediation costs, though by then I had stopped measuring justice by the length of anyone's sentence and started measuring it, instead, by the simple fact that children in that elementary school were now sitting in classrooms built the way the public had actually paid for them to be built. Nikolai's mother, a woman named Audley who had never once, in 10 years, asked me a single question about my own life beyond how well I was managing her son's demanding schedule, called me once, weeks after he moved out. She asked whether I had known before it became public what he had actually been doing. I told her the truth, that I had known enough, eventually, to understand it needed to stop, and that I regretted it had taken this particular shape to get there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice stripped of the polite distance she had always maintained with me, she said she was sorry, for years spent quietly agreeing with her son's assessment of me rather than forming her own. We have not spoken since, but I think of that call sometimes, the strange, late arrival of an apology that changes nothing and still, somehow, matters. I moved eventually into a small apartment near my sister and Tobias, close enough that we began having dinner together most weeks for the first time in years, far enough from the house Nikolai and I had shared that I stopped, within a few months, rehearsing justifications for opinions I had never actually needed to defend in the first place. My sister helped me unpack the last of my boxes on a bright afternoon in early spring, and when we finished, we sat on the floor of my new living room, my architectural portfolio spread open between us, finally, genuinely just my own work, nothing hidden behind a birdhouse anymore. I think often about the woman I was the evening Nikolai gently told our real estate agent I wasn't ready to make big decisions, while I stood there holding proof of exactly how ready I had always been. I think about how long it took me to understand that his reasonableness had never once meant respect. I did not destroy Nikolai. I want to be precise about that, the way precision has come to matter to me since. Nikolai destroyed the trust of a community that believed its schools and roads were being built with the integrity his firm had spent decades promising. I simply stopped allowing him to narrate my own capability back to me, and once I stopped, the rest of what he had built, brick by careful brick, no longer had anywhere left to hide. The most dangerous thing a man like Nikolai can do is assume that a woman who has stopped arguing about being underestimated has also stopped documenting exactly how wrong he is. I had 15 months of documentation running beneath my silence, and by the time he understood that, the story had already been finished, filed, and delivered, in an office lined with renderings of the very buildings he had quietly compromised, by a woman he had once gently decided wasn't ready to make big decisions.